There comes a moment in every empire's trajectory when, confidence transforms into desperation, when the facade of power cracks, exposing the anxiety beneath. For the United States, that moment materialized in the spring of 2025, on a day the administration branded Liberation Day. While the White House press secretary beamed for the cameras and spoke eloquently about economic sovereignty, behind closed doors at the Treasury Department, career economists were discreetly polishing their resumes. They understood what was approaching. I'm Dav, you're watching Hems Reports, and what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you understand what's happening to the American economy right now. Part 1. The Tariff Bomb. On April 2, 2025, President Trump authorized an executive order that would restructure the global economic landscape. He imposed a minimum 10% tariff on all United States imports, with rates escalating as high as 50% on 57 specific nations. By August, the average effective tariff rate had climbed to nearly 17%, the highest level in over a century. To provide perspective, the last time America taxed imports at these rates, the Great Depression was just beginning. But here's what distinguishes this from every other protectionist maneuver in history. Trump isn't implementing this because he genuinely believes in tariffs. He's implementing it because he believes in chaos. This is the Madman theory in action, the calculated projection of unpredictability to extract concessions from adversaries and allies alike. And the question keeping Treasury officials awake at 3 a.m. is straightforward. Is this economic brilliance, or is this national suicide? Part 2. Nixon's Ghost. To comprehend what's unfolding right now, you need to travel back to 1968. Richard Nixon, campaigning for president, faced a problem. The Vietnam War was a grinding machine, consuming American lives and taxpayer money with no resolution in sight. The North Vietnamese weren't yielding at the negotiating table because they understood America was a democracy, predictable and constrained by public sentiment. So Nixon, through his advisor Henry Kissinger, engineered a strategy. He would convince them he was unhinged. Nixon wanted the communists to believe he was capable of anything, up to and including deploying nuclear weapons. He instructed his staff to circulate rumors that the president had been pushed beyond his limits, that he was volatile, that there was no predicting what he might do next. The objective was to generate such profound fear of unpredictability that adversaries would capitulate rather than risk provoking him. Historians call this the Madman theory. And while Nixon's implementation ultimately failed, the concept has haunted American foreign policy ever since. Part 3. The Strategy Resurrected. Fast forward to 2025. Trump has resurrected the Madman theory, not for warfare, but for commerce. His Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, labels it strategic uncertainty. The premise is that if trading partners never know what Trump will do next, they'll be compelled to negotiate from a position of vulnerability, constantly scrambling to avoid the next tariff explosion. In game theory terminology, unpredictability becomes leverage. And initially, it appeared to function. The United Kingdom swiftly agreed to concessions. NATO members committed to increasing defense spending to 5% of GDP, a demand that had been dismissed for years. Even China, after months of escalating retaliatory tariffs, agreed to a temporary ceasefire, reducing bilateral tariffs from 125% to 10%. From Trump's perspective, the chaos was yielding dividends. But here's the trap. The Madman theory only functions if everyone believes you're unstable enough to damage yourself along with them, yet rational enough to halt short of total annihilation. And Trump has already shattered that delicate equilibrium. By publicly boasting about his unpredictability, by making it integral to his brand, he's eliminated the ambiguity that makes the strategy effective. When you announce you're playing the madman, you're no longer a madman. You're just a performer everyone can see through. And world leaders are beginning to call his bluff. Part 4. When Bluffs Get Called. China, after observing Trump pause tariffs, postpone auto duties, and negotiate exemptions for dozens of industries, has recognized something critical. Trump blinks. He threatens comprehensive economic warfare, then retreats when Wall Street panics or consumer prices surge. This occurred in April when the stock market crashed following Liberation Day. It happened again in August when Treasury bond yields spiked. Each time Trump withdraws, he forfeits credibility. And in international negotiations, credibility is currency. Part 5. The real cost to Americans. Let's discuss what these tariffs actually accomplish. The Tax Foundation estimates that Trump's tariffs will cost the average American household $1,500 in 2026. That's not political rhetoric. That's mathematics. When you tax imports, American companies pay those taxes, and then they transfer the costs to consumers. Your toys cost more. Your electronics cost more. Your copper pipes, your aluminum cans, your automobiles. Everything that crosses a border is now 15 to 20% more expensive. But the suffering doesn't end at the checkout counter. Trump promised that tariffs would restore manufacturing jobs, that factories would return to American soil. It hasn't occurred. Jobs growth decelerated throughout 2025. Manufacturing employment is stagnant. Why? Because you cannot rebuild an industrial foundation in 12 months. It required 40 years to offshore American manufacturing. You cannot reverse that with executive orders and tax penalties. The Penn-Wharton budget model analyzed the numbers, and they're devastating. They project that Trump's tariff policies, if sustained, will reduce long-run GDP by 6% and wages by 5%. For a middle-income household, that translates to a $22,000 lifetime loss. Consider that $22,000, not because of a recession or a pandemic, but because of deliberate policy decisions. And here's the devastating part. The economic damage from these tariffs is twice as severe as if the government had simply raised the corporate tax rate from 21% to 36%. Tariffs are among the most distorting, economically destructive taxes you can impose. They don't merely raise prices, they fracture supply chains, obliterate comparative advantage, and trigger retaliation. The entire edifice of global trade, constructed painstakingly over 70 years, is being dismantled for what amounts to a negotiating tactic. Part 6. The Seductive Logic and Why It Fails. Now Trump and his advisors would argue this is worthwhile. They'd contend that short-term pain is necessary to break China's stranglehold on American industry, to compel companies to reshore production, to restore economic sovereignty. And there's a seductive logic to that argument. America does have a massive trade deficit. American manufacturing has been hollowed out. Something needs to change. But here's what they're not revealing. The reason tariffs won't work is that the United States economy is no longer structured for manufacturing. The American workforce is expensive, highly educated, and concentrated in service industries. Even if you tax Chinese imports astronomically, companies won't construct factories in Ohio. They'll construct them in Vietnam, in Mexico, in India. The jobs won't return home. They'll just relocate somewhere else that's cheaper. Part 7. The debt crisis nobody wants to discuss. And while Trump plays economic chicken with the world, there's a much larger crisis developing in the background. A crisis that makes tariff wars appear like a sideshow. The United States national debt has crossed $38 trillion. Let me repeat that slowly. $38 trillion. That's $113,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. That's $285,000 per household. But the raw figure, as staggering as it is, doesn't capture the full horror of the situation. What should terrify you is the interest. In 2020, when COVID first struck, the United States government paid $345 billion in interest on the debt. That was already a massive sum. 6 years later, in 2026, that number has nearly tripled. The government is now paying close to $1 trillion per year just in interest. Not paying down the debt, not funding programs, just paying the bankers their cut. To put this in perspective, interest payments are now the second largest item in the federal budget, larger than defense, larger than Medicare. The only thing the government spends more on is Social Security, and these payments are projected to grow to $1.8 trillion by 2035. That's not a distant problem. That's less than 10 years away. Part 8. Fiscal Dominance. Former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, a woman not known for hyperbole, recently warned that the United States is approaching something called fiscal dominance. This is the point where the debt becomes so enormous that it constrains the Federal Reserve's ability to combat inflation. Imagine the economy as a car, Yellen explained. The Treasury is the driver, ready to spend. The Fed is the brake, ready to raise interest rates if the Treasury spends excessively. But now the car is towing a $38 trillion trailer. The weight is so massive that if the Fed hits the brakes too hard, the entire system explodes. Here's why. When the Fed raises interest rates to fight inflation, it increases the government's borrowing costs. But when the debt is $38 trillion, even a small increase in rates translates to hundreds of billions in additional interest payments. Those payments don't disappear. They flow into the private sector as income, which then gets spent, which then fuels more inflation. The Fed's anti-inflation tool becomes an inflation accelerator. The car is out of control. Part 9. The Tariff Revenue Delusion. And Trump's solution to this? Tariffs. He promised that tariff revenue would help pay down the debt, maybe even replace income taxes entirely. The numbers tell a different story. Tariffs are expected to bring in between $300 billion to $400 billion per year. That sounds impressive until you realize it's barely 1/3 of the annual interest payment. If every single dollar of tariff revenue went straight to debt service, it would take 120 years to pay off the current balance. And that's assuming the debt doesn't grow, which it absolutely will, so the tariffs can't save the budget. Part 10. The Elon Musk Efficiency Fantasy. So what about spending cuts? Trump appointed Elon Musk to lead the Department of Government Efficiency with a mandate to find $2 trillion in savings. Musk, being Musk, promised to revolutionize government the way he revolutionized electric cars and social media. But here's the problem. The federal government isn't a tech company you can disrupt with clever algorithms and mass layoffs. Most federal spending is mandatory. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the debt account for roughly 70% of all outlays. You cannot touch those without a political bloodbath. The remaining 30% includes defense, which Trump has actually increased. So, where exactly are you going to cut $2 trillion? From the National Park Service? From weather forecasting? From food safety inspections? The brutal truth is that the United States government has constructed a spending machine that cannot be stopped. 75 million baby boomers are retiring and enrolling in Social Security and Medicare. That's not a policy choice. That's demographics. And demographics don't care about your budget theories or your efficiency task forces. The costs are baked in, and they're growing every year. Part 11. Imperial Liquidation. This is why, honestly, some economists believe the United States has already entered what they call the era of imperial liquidation. The empire can no longer afford to maintain itself. So it begins selling off assets, squeezing allies, and resorting to coercion. The desperation becomes visible. And that's exactly what we're witnessing. Look at Venezuela. For years, the United States tried to overthrow Nicolás Maduro with sanctions, coups, and diplomatic pressure. It failed. But then in late 2025, American oil refineries started running low on heavy crude, the specific type of oil they need to produce diesel. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, drained by the previous administration to keep gas prices low, was nearly empty. So what did Trump do? He quietly sent diplomats back to Caracas to negotiate with the very man he tried to destroy. That's not strength. That's desperation. Or look at China. Trump ran on a platform of destroying the Chinese economy with tariffs and sanctions. But behind closed doors, Treasury Secretary Bessent had to call Beijing and beg them not to dump their holdings of United States Treasury bonds. Because if China decides to liquidate even a fraction of the hundreds of billions in debt they hold, American interest rates would spike, mortgages would become unaffordable, and the stock market would collapse. Trump is trying to hold a gun to China's head while China holds the deed to his house. Part 12. The Fundamental Contradiction. This is the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Trump's Madman strategy. You cannot project strength through chaos when everyone knows you're desperate. You cannot threaten economic war when you're buried under $38 trillion of debt and your biggest adversary is your biggest creditor. The bluff only works if you have a strong hand. And Trump's hand is garbage. So where does this leave us? Scenario 1. Full throttle. If Trump pushes ahead with the full tariff regime, if he refuses to blink, the economic damage could push the United States into recession. Job losses, falling incomes, political unrest. The Madman strategy crashes the economy to prove a point that nobody believes anyway. That's the suicide scenario. But then there's scenario 2, backing down. If Trump backs down, if he keeps negotiating carve-outs and delays and exemptions, then the entire strategy collapses. Allies and adversaries learn that his threats are hollow. They stop taking him seriously. America's leverage evaporates, and the United States becomes just another nation, declining slowly, unable to dictate terms. That's the slow death scenario. And there's a third possibility. And honestly, it's the one that terrifies economists the most. The United States might try to inflate its way out. If the government can't cut spending and it can't raise enough revenue, there's only one option left: print money. Not literally printing, but having the Federal Reserve buy government debt by creating new dollars. This would allow the government to pay its bills without default, but it would also devalue the currency, driving inflation higher and higher until the dollar loses its status as the global reserve currency. And if the dollar loses that status, if oil starts trading in yuan, if countries stop holding treasury bonds as safe assets, the American standard of living collapses. Suddenly, imports become crushingly expensive. Gas prices quintuple. Electronics become luxury goods. The wealth that Americans have taken for granted for 80 years evaporates. This is the nightmare that keeps former Federal Reserve chairs awake at night. But let's be clear. None of this had to happen. The United States has the largest economy on Earth, the most innovative companies, the best universities, and abundant natural resources. The country could have managed its debt, invested in infrastructure, and maintained its alliances. Instead, it chose the Madman strategy. It chose to weaponize uncertainty, to burn credibility, to treat the global economy like a reality television show. And now the bill is coming due. Trump promised to make America great again, to restore manufacturing, to drain the swamp. Instead, he's draining the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, begging enemies for resources, and pushing the country closer to the fiscal cliff. Some optimists argue that America always finds a way, that the economy is resilient, that innovation will save the day, that the rest of the world needs the United States more than the United States needs them. Maybe. But betting your entire economy on the hope that something will work out is not a strategy. It's a prayer. Others point out that Trump's poll numbers on the economy are slipping, that consumer sentiment is souring, that even his own party is starting to push back on the tariffs. Maybe political pressure will force a course correction. Maybe the Supreme Court, currently weighing the legality of the tariffs, will strike them down and end the experiment. Maybe sanity will prevail. But if history teaches us anything, it's this: empires don't collapse because they lack resources or technology. They collapse because their leaders lose touch with reality. They collapse because arrogance blinds them to danger. They collapse because they believe their own myths of invincibility until the moment those myths shatter. Part 16. The long-term costs. So, Trump's madman strategy might extract a few short-term victories, maybe a trade deal here, or a diplomatic concession there. But honestly, the long-term costs are really starting to add up. Every time he threatens and then backs down, well, he loses credibility. Every time he imposes a tariff, he damages supply chains and raises costs. And every time he borrows more to fund tax cuts, he digs the debt hole even deeper. The foundation is cracking. And yeah, the rest of the world is definitely watching. China is building alternative payment systems. Europe is hedging its bets. The BRICS nations are quietly constructing a parallel financial architecture that doesn't rely on the dollar. They're not doing this because they hate America. They're doing it because they've seen the madman act before, and they know how it ends. Part 17. Genius or suicide? So, is Trump's economic strategy genius or suicide? The answer might actually be both. It's genius in the sense that it's forcing conversations that really needed to happen. America's reliance on Chinese manufacturing is a strategic vulnerability. The trade deficit is unsustainable. The debt is a ticking time bomb. These are real problems that, honestly, decades of politicians just ignored. But the execution? It's suicidal. You don't fix a trade deficit by destroying the global trading system. You don't rebuild manufacturing by making everything more expensive. You don't restore confidence by projecting chaos. And for sure, you don't solve a debt crisis by borrowing trillions more for tax cuts while pretending tariffs will balance the budget. Part 18. The solutions that exist. The tragedy is that there are solutions. The United States could invest in education and infrastructure to make American workers more productive. It could reform the tax code to raise revenue without killing growth. It could negotiate multilateral trade agreements that protect workers while maintaining open markets. It could implement a long-term debt reduction plan that phases in gradually without crashing the economy. But none of those solutions are dramatic. None of them make good television. None of them satisfy the urge to punish enemies and reward supporters. So instead, we get the madman strategy. We get Liberation Day and reciprocal tariffs and strategic uncertainty. We get theater masquerading as policy, and while the show plays out, the fundamentals keep deteriorating. The debt keeps growing at $6 billion per day. Interest payments keep climbing. The manufacturing jobs don't come back. The trade deficit barely budges. The gap between rich and poor widens, and slowly, quietly, America's position in the world erodes. Part 19. History repeating. The madman theory failed in the 1970s because the Soviets didn't believe Nixon was actually insane. They called his bluff, and the strategy collapsed. Trump's version will fail for the same reason. China, Europe, and the rest of the world have seen this playbook before. They know that beneath the chaos, there's just desperation. And desperate powers don't inspire fear. They inspire opportunism. Part 20. What to watch. 2026 will be the year the world discovers whether Trump can pull off the impossible, whether the madman strategy can bend economics to his will, whether sheer force of personality can overcome $38 trillion of debt and a century of globalization. The odds are not in his favor. If you want to understand what happens next, don't listen to the press conferences or the tweets. Watch the bond market. Watch the dollar's value against other currencies. Watch whether countries keep buying treasury debt or start quietly selling. Watch whether inflation stays contained or starts creeping higher. These are the real indicators. These are the numbers that don't lie. And if you see those numbers start to move in the wrong direction, if you see bond yields spiking or the dollar weakening or inflation accelerating, then you'll know the madman strategy isn't genius. It's suicide. And we're all passengers on this ride. The final word. The question is not whether the United States will pay a price for this strategy. The question is how high that price will be. The game is on. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the clock is ticking. This is Dav for Hems Reports. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure you're subscribed, because 2026 is going to be one of the most volatile economic years in modern history. This is the year we find out whether American exceptionalism is real or just a story we told ourselves while the empire slowly crumbled. And either way, you're going to want to understand what's happening before the mainstream media figures it out. Thanks for watching.